Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Jackson, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1848, when the first records of the Reed plantation disappearance were officially documented. Located approximately 17 miles east of Jackson, Mississippi, along what is now known as the Pearl River, the Reed plantation stood as one of the largest cotton producers in Rankin County. The plantation's owner, James Reed, was known throughout the region for his excessive wealth and his reputation as a shrewd businessman. But it wasn't James Reed who would become the central figure in this disturbing chronicle. It was his younger brother, Isaiah Reed, and a woman named Juliet Montrose, whose interconnected fates would cast a long shadow over Jackson for generations to come. According to county records preserved in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, Isaiah Reed returned to Jackson in early 1847 after spending nearly 7 years in Europe, primarily in France and England, where he had been sent to complete his education. Unlike his older brother, Isaiah had developed what locals described as peculiar sensibilities during his time abroad. Several letters exchanged between James and his business associates, later discovered in 1863 during Union occupation, revealed growing concerns about Isaiah's dangerous philosophies and inappropriate sympathies that were deemed incompatible with the Southern way of life. Upon his return to Mississippi, Isaiah was installed in a separate residence on the plantation property, a modest 2-story structure positioned approximately half a mile from the main house, near the edge of a cypress swamp that local workers reportedly refused to enter after sunset. The location of this house, according to survey maps from 1852, placed it in an unusual isolation, neither fully part of the working plantation nor properly integrated with the family estate. This geographical separation would later be described by Reverend Thomas Wilkins of the First Presbyterian Church of Jackson as a physical manifestation of the young man's moral exile. What makes this case particularly unsettling is how thoroughly it was obscured from official records for nearly a century. Were it not for the discovery of a collection of personal journals in 1954, during the renovation of an old courthouse in Raymond, Mississippi, the events surrounding Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose might have remained forever buried in the collective silence that often shrouds the most disturbing chapters of American history. The journal, attributed to a county clerk named Elijah Whitaker, details his personal observations and collected testimonies regarding what he cryptically referred to as the business at the Reed place. Whitaker's position granted him access to information that never made it into official documentation, and his meticulous notes, written in a tight, cramped hand on the margins and between the lines of mundane county business, provide the foundation for the account that follows. As we piece together this narrative, we must acknowledge that much remains in shadow. Some facts can be verified through cross-referencing with census data, property records, and surviving correspondence. Other elements rely on testimonies passed down through generations, whispered behind closed doors, and preserved in the oral histories collected by WPA workers in the 1930s. What emerges is not a complete picture, but rather a mosaic of disturbing fragments that, when assembled, reveal a pattern too consistent to dismiss. The first indications that something was amiss at the Reed plantation came in the early autumn of 1847. According to Whitaker's journal, 3 enslaved individuals had allegedly escaped from the property within the span of 2 weeks, an unusual occurrence for a plantation known for its brutal enforcement of boundaries. James Reed's response, documented in a letter to the local sheriff, was swift and severe. Additional overseers were hired, nighttime patrols were doubled, and hunting dogs were brought in from as far away as Virginia. Yet, curiously, there is no record that any of the missing persons were recaptured. It was during this period of heightened tension that Juliet Montrose first appears in the historical record. Described in Whitaker's journal as a Creole woman from New Orleans of indeterminate status, Montrose arrived in Jackson in late October of 1847, taking up residence at the Carroll Hotel on State Street. Her presence caused immediate speculation, as women rarely traveled alone in this period, particularly to a frontier town like Jackson, which had been the state capital for only 15 years and still retained much of its rough character. According to hotel registers preserved in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, Montrose paid for 3 months' lodging in advance with gold coins. The hotel owner's wife, Sarah Carroll, later told Whitaker that Montrose spoke with an educated accent and claimed to be in Jackson on family business of a delicate nature. What that business might have been remained unspecified, but multiple entries in Whitaker's journal note that within days of her arrival, Montrose was observed visiting the county clerk's office, reviewing property records related to the Reed plantation and surrounding lands. The connection between Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose was first established publicly at a holiday gathering hosted by the Carrolls in early December of 1847. Several witnesses later recalled their animated conversation, conducted partly in French, which drew attention and disapproval from other guests. James Reed, also in attendance, was observed watching the interaction with what one witness described as a face-like thunderclouds gathering. Before the evening concluded, James had departed with his wife, leaving Isaiah behind, an incident that would later be referred to in local gossip as the first fracture. What followed over the next several months has been pieced together from multiple sources, including Whitaker's journal, correspondence between various Reed family associates, and the posthumously published memoirs of Dr. William Carruthers, who served as the Reed family physician. A pattern of clandestine meetings between Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose emerged, often taking place in the modest library of the Carroll Hotel, or, more provocatively, during afternoon rides along the Pearl River. Their association, unusual by the strict social codes of antebellum Mississippi, became the subject of increasing speculation. During this same period, according to plantation records later examined by historian Martha Simmons in her 1968 thesis, Silent History's Undocumented Resistance in Antebellum Mississippi, there were concerning changes in the Reed plantation's operation. Output decreased despite favorable growing conditions. Equipment was found damaged with increasing frequency. A storage barn containing harvested cotton was destroyed by fire in February 1848, an incident investigated as potential arson, but never solved. Most disturbing were the whispers that began to circulate among neighboring plantations about strange gatherings observed near the cypress swamp bordering the Reed property. The tension reached a breaking point in early March of 1848. According to a letter written by James Reed's wife Elizabeth to her sister in Virginia, preserved in the Barrett family collection at the University of Virginia, Isaiah and James had engaged in a terrible quarrel that has severed them completely. The exact nature of this dispute went unspecified in Elizabeth's carefully worded correspondence, but she did mention that I has removed his personal effects from the separate house and taken rooms in town, an arrangement that brings J considerable relief, despite the gossip it will inevitably produce. This relocation placed Isaiah in closer proximity to Juliet Montrose, and according to Whitaker's increasingly troubled journal entries, their association became more public and more political in nature. They were observed visiting the quarters of enslaved workers on neighboring plantations under the pretense of Montrose purchasing household staff for a residence she claimed to be establishing. During these visits, According to testimony later collected by federal investigators in 1864, they asked unusual questions about family separations, working conditions, and specific incidents of punishment. More alarmingly, from the perspective of local authorities, they were rumored to be discussing ideas about natural rights and the political situation in places like Haiti and the northern states. On the night of April 17, 1848, something happened at the Reed plantation that would never be fully documented in any official capacity. According to Whitaker's journal, he was awakened shortly after midnight by the county sheriff, who requested his immediate assistance regarding a disturbance of the most serious nature. Upon arriving at the plantation, Whitaker observed numerous mounted men carrying torches, the main house illuminated with every lamp and candle, and sounds of female distress coming from within. The entry abruptly ends there, and the next 14 pages have been torn from the journal. He notes only that the business has been concluded to the satisfaction of all principal parties, with discretion being the better part of valor in such cases. What can be verified through other sources is that on April 18, 1848, James Reed placed a notice in the local newspaper offering a substantial reward for information leading to the whereabouts of his brother Isaiah, who was described as disturbed in his faculties and requiring family assistance. A similar notice regarding Juliette Montrose was placed by the sheriff's office, describing her as a confidence woman operating under false pretenses and wanted for questioning regarding business improprieties. Neither Isaiah Reed nor Juliette Montrose was ever publicly located. When the record resumes on May 3rd, Whitaker makes no direct reference to the events of that night, but his handwriting has noticeably changed, becoming less controlled, with frequent ink blots and crossed-out passages. Their disappearance coincided with that of 17 individuals enslaved on the Reed plantation, a fact not mentioned in any newspaper, but documented in an insurance claim filed by James Reed in June of 1848, preserved in the records of the Southern Mutual Assurance Company. In the months that followed, James Reed sold the plantation at a considerable loss and relocated his family to Texas. The property changed hands multiple times over the next decade, with each owner reporting difficulties retaining workers willing to remain after sunset. The separate house where Isaiah had resided was destroyed in what was officially recorded as an accident with a kerosene lamp in 1851, though local rumors preserved in oral histories suggested intentional destruction sanctioned by community leaders. The case might have remained merely one of many mysterious disappearances from that troubled period, were it not for a discovery made in 1863. Union soldiers occupying Jackson uncovered a sealed room in the basement of a building that had previously served as the office of a shipping company owned by a close associate of James Reed. Inside, they discovered a collection of documents, including correspondence between Reed and various parties regarding his brother, as well as several items identified as belonging to Juliette Montrose, including a distinctive locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman bearing a strong resemblance to Montrose herself. More disturbing was the discovery of a journal believed to have been written by Isaiah Reed, detailing his growing moral objections to his family's source of wealth and his encounters with Juliette Montrose, who, according to his writings, had approached him specifically because of rumors about his unorthodox views. The journal outlined what Isaiah described as their shared purpose and made cryptic references to the network and safe passage arrangements. The final entry, dated April 16, 1848, contains a passage that has been the subject of historical debate ever since. J believes we have been discovered. The risk is now greater than we anticipated, but to abandon the plan would constitute a moral failure I cannot bear on my conscience. Tomorrow evening, all will be decided. Either 17 souls will begin their journey to liberty, or I will have failed them entirely. M has secured the necessary documents and transportation to the river. God grant us the courage and fortune this endeavor requires. Union Colonel Robert Harrison forwarded these documents to federal authorities, noting in his accompanying letter that they appeared to describe an operation of the Underground Railroad previously unknown to Northern abolitionists. He requested further investigation, but with the war still raging, no immediate action was taken. By the time federal investigators arrived in Jackson in 1864, many of the documents had disappeared from military custody, and witnesses were reluctant to speak with Northern officials. What remained, however, were persistent local stories about the fate of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose. According to accounts collected by WPA interviewers in the 1930s from elderly residents of Rankin County, the pair had indeed attempted to lead a group of enslaved individuals to freedom on the night of April 17th. Their plan reportedly involved traveling through the cypress swamp to reach a tributary of the Pearl River, where a boat was waiting to take them downstream toward the Gulf of Mexico. But according to these accounts, the group never reached the river. One account, attributed to a man who had been part of the search party as a young man, stated only that justice was rough in those days, especially for those who violated the most sacred trust of our society. Another account, from a woman who claimed her grandmother had worked in the Reed household, suggested that Isaiah had been given an opportunity to renounce his actions and return to his family, but had instead spoken words so inflammatory and dangerous that they sealed his fate on the spot. As for Montrose, the same source claimed she had fought like a wildcat and cursed her captors in both English and French before being silenced permanently. The fate of those who had attempted to escape with them went unmentioned in most accounts, though one elderly man, speaking to WPA interviewer Clarissa Johnson in 1934, claimed that the swamp had a way of keeping secrets and that there are places out there where the ground is unnatural soft, if you take my meaning. The most concrete evidence emerged in 1952 when a severe drought caused water levels in the cypress swamp to drop dramatically. A search party organized by James Reed, consisting of overseers and neighboring planters, intercepted them deep in the swamp. What happened next was described only in the most oblique terms by those claiming knowledge of the events. Local hunters discovered a collection of rusted chains, tools, and personal effects, including buttons, a pocket watch, and what appeared to be a woman's hair comb, all concentrated in an area of approximately 30 square yards. County authorities were notified, but according to newspaper accounts from that time, the sheriff determined there was no cause for further investigation of artifacts clearly abandoned many decades prior. Historians and anthropologists who later became aware of the discovery have noted that the location aligns with the area identified in local folklore as the Judgment Ground, a place whispered about but never specifically marked on any official map of the region. Requests for a proper archaeological survey of the site, made in 1967, were denied by the property owner, and subsequent development in the area has rendered the precise location impossible to identify. The story of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose represents more than just a historical mystery or a tale of failed escape. It embodies the silences that permeate American history, the stories deliberately obscured, the records intentionally destroyed, the witnesses silenced through both violence and the more subtle pressure of community consensus. That we know anything at all about their story is due to the fragments that survived this systematic erasure: Whitaker's incomplete journal, Isaiah's recovered writings, the physical evidence uncovered decades later, and the whispered stories that refused to die despite every effort to suppress them. In the absence of complete records, we are left with questions that may never be fully answered. Was Juliet Montrose connected to the organized abolitionist movement, or was she operating independently? How had she identified Isaiah Reed as a potential ally? Were there others involved in their plan who escaped detection? And perhaps most haunting of all, had there been other attempts before theirs that were so thoroughly suppressed that no trace of them remains in the historical record? What seems most certain, based on the available evidence, is that on an April night in 1848, two people chose to risk everything to challenge a system they had come to view as morally unconscionable. For that choice, it appears they paid the ultimate price, their story almost lost among countless others that remain forever untold. The separate house where Isaiah Reed once lived no longer exists. The cypress swamp has been partially drained and developed. The Reed plantation's lands have been subdivided and repurposed many times over the intervening centuries. Nothing physical remains to mark the events that transpired there. But in archives and family stories, in fragments of journals and collected folklore, the echoes of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose persist, a reminder that beneath the official narratives of history lie countless suppressed truths waiting to be uncovered. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is not what we know, but what we don't, and what was deliberately kept from us. As historian Martha Simmons wrote in the conclusion of her thesis, the true horror of American history lies not in the atrocities we have documented, but in those that were so effectively concealed that we can now perceive them only as shadows, negative spaces in the historical record that hint at terrors too great for even their perpetrators to acknowledge. In 1869, a journalist from Harper's Weekly visited Jackson to report on conditions in the post-war South. During his stay, he recorded a conversation with an elderly local judge who, when questioned about rumors regarding the Reed plantation, responded with a statement that perhaps best encapsulates the legacy of this dark episode. "There are matters, young man, about which it is better not to inquire too deeply, not because the truth doesn't matter, but because once acknowledged, it cannot be unknown. Some truths change those who come to understand them, and not always for the better. For those 17 souls who disappeared into the night alongside Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose, there is no memorial, no marked grave, no official acknowledgement of their existence or their fate. In 1958, during construction of a new highway that would pass near the former Reed plantation, workers uncovered a collection of personal items buried approximately 4 feet below the surface. Buttons made of bone and brass, fragments of what appeared to be hand-forged tools, a single shoe with unique repairs consistent with footwear from the mid-19th century, and most notably, a locket matching the description of the one previously attributed to Juliet Montrose, though its contents had been removed. Their names, which Isaiah had so carefully recorded in his journal, according to Colonel Harrison's inventory of the discovered documents, were among the pages that disappeared before investigators could properly document them. The items were briefly noted in an archaeological survey but were not preserved, their current whereabouts unknown. A local newspaper ran a small article about the discovery on page 17 of its August 12th edition, speculating briefly about a possible connection to old folklore regarding a disturbance at the Reed place. Within days, the newspaper published a retraction and correction, stating that the items were likely random debris with no historical significance, and apologizing for any confusion caused by irresponsible speculation. The journalist who wrote the original article left the paper shortly thereafter. The final known reference to Isaiah Reed in any family correspondence comes from a letter written by his niece, Catherine Reed Thornton, to her cousin in 1882. In it, she mentions finding a small book of French poetry among her late father's possessions, inscribed to J.R. from J.M., with the date April 15, 1848, and the phrase "pour le courage de suivre sa conscience," for the courage to follow one's conscience. Catherine wrote, "I asked Mother about this volume and the inscription, and her face went as white as laundered linen. She took it from my hands and cast it into the fire without a word of explanation. When I pressed her, she said only, 'There was no JM, and we had no uncle named Isaiah. The book is a forgery, and its destruction necessary for the family's peace.'" I did not dare question further, but I cannot help wondering what terrible secret could inspire such fear decades after whatever events transpired. As for the Carroll Hotel where Juliette Montrose stayed during her time in Jackson, it was destroyed in the Great Fire that consumed much of the city during the Civil War. The site was later rebuilt as a commercial building that housed, among other businesses, the offices of the Mississippi Colonization Society, an organization dedicated to promoting the idea that formerly enslaved individuals should be relocated to Africa rather than integrated into American society. In 1964, Dr. Marcus Jenkins, a historian researching 19th-century resistance movements, attempted to locate descendants of those believed to have escaped with Isaiah and Juliette. His inquiries in northern cities with established communities of formerly enslaved people yielded tantalizing but inconclusive results. In Cleveland, he interviewed an elderly woman who claimed her grandmother had spoken of the terrible night in the swamp and the white man and woman who died trying to help. But when he attempted to schedule a follow-up interview, he found she had left the city without forwarding information. His research notes, archived at Howard University, conclude, "The systematic destruction of evidence and suppression of oral histories has created perhaps insurmountable obstacles to fully reconstructing these events. We may never know if any of the 17 escaped or if all perished that night in 1848. The cypress swamp that features so prominently in accounts of that fateful night has its own disturbing postscript." Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, local residents reported unusual phenomena in the area: unexplained lights, disembodied voices, and a persistent sense of being watched. Such accounts are common in many rural areas and are typically dismissed as superstition, but what makes the Reed Plantation swamp unusual is the consistency of the reports across decades and from individuals with no apparent knowledge of the area's history. In 1922, a local pastor recorded in his personal diary that he had been called to the home of a family living near the former Reed property because their young son had become hysterical and inconsolable after playing near the swamp. According to the pastor, the child claimed to have seen a lady in old-fashioned dress with a terrible mark around her neck who tried to lead him deeper into the trees while saying something he couldn't understand in a funny voice. The family relocated shortly thereafter. The most recent documented connection to this nearly forgotten history came in 1969, when an elderly man named Samuel Wilson contacted the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, claiming to possess a metal box that had been passed down in his family for generations, with instructions that it should remain sealed until 100 years after the judgment in the swamp. Wilson, who identified himself as the great-grandson of one of James Reed's overseers, explained that the box had been entrusted to his great-grandfather by Reed himself before the family's departure to Texas, with explicit instructions about its handling. According to department records, arrangements were made for Wilson to deliver the box to historians, but he died of a sudden heart attack the day before the scheduled meeting. His family, apparently unaware of the box or its significance, reported no such item among his possessions. Subsequent inquiries by department staff were met with polite but firm resistance from family members who expressed discomfort with what they termed dredging up ancient matters best left buried. And so the full truth remains elusive, obscured by time, deliberate suppression, and the natural erosion of memory. What we can reconstruct with reasonable certainty is that two individuals, Isaiah Reed a man born into privilege who came to reject the source of that privilege, and Juliet Montrose, a woman whose precise origins and motivations remain unclear, formed an alliance that challenged the foundational institutions of their society. Their challenge failed. Their story was nearly erased, and the system they opposed continued for another 17 years before being dismantled by war rather than moral reckoning. Yet their ghost story persists, not as a tale of supernatural haunting, but as a reminder of history's unquiet dead, those whose stories were supposed to remain untold, but who refused to be silenced completely. In the gaps and silences of the historical record, in the documents that survived destruction, in the oral histories passed down despite community pressure, we can still discern the outlines of their defiance. For those who study America's most troubled histories, the story of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose represents something beyond a mere footnote or curiosity. It stands as evidence of the complex moral struggles that have always existed even within systems designed to suppress such questioning, and of the high price paid by those who acted on their convictions. It reminds us that resistance has always existed, even when the historical record has been sanitized to suggest otherwise. The cypress swamp where their journey ended has since been replaced by suburban development, the land's history unknown to most who now call it home. The courthouse where Elijah Whitaker once secretly documented the business at the Reed place has been renovated multiple times, its basement archives modernized and reorganized. The spot where the Carroll Hotel once stood is now occupied by a bank building whose employees likely have no knowledge of the woman who once resided there briefly before disappearing into history's shadows. But in libraries and archives, in academic papers and family legends, in the cultural memory of a community shaped by events both acknowledged and denied, Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose remain, not as fully realized historical figures whose every action and motivation can be documented and analyzed, but as representatives of a fundamental truth that even in the darkest periods, there have always been those who recognized injustice and were willing to risk everything to oppose it. Their failure does not diminish the significance of their attempt. In many ways, it makes it more poignant, a reminder of how thoroughly power can suppress dissent when that dissent threatens fundamental structures. Yet the very fact that we can tell even this fragmentary version of their story suggests that such suppression is never complete. Some echo always remains for those willing to listen for it. As the sun sets over what was once the Reed plantation, there are no visible reminders of Isaiah, Juliet, or those 17 individuals whose names were lost to history. No markers indicate where they may have perished. No monuments commemorate their resistance. But in the gap between official history and suppressed truth, their story continues to resonate, a whisper rather than a shout, but persistent nonetheless. For those who seek to understand America's complex and often troubled past, such whispers matter. They remind us that history is not merely what was documented and preserved, but also what was deliberately obscured, and that the most important stories may be those we have to piece together from fragments, hints, and the echoing silences where truth once spoke. In the words attributed to Isaiah Reed in his final journal entry, history may forget us, but the moral arc remains, and perhaps someday what we attempt tonight will be understood as part of a larger struggle that, despite all opposition, bends eventually toward justice. Whether any of them lived to see even a glimpse of that justice remains unknown, one final, haunting question in a story defined by its unanswered questions. But perhaps, in the telling and retelling of their story, in the acknowledgement of their existence and their choice, some small measure of that long-delayed justice is finally achieved. The physical traces of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose have been largely erased from the landscape, but their presence lingers in unexpected places. In 1959, a history professor from Tougaloo College named Dr. Eleanor Williams began collecting oral histories from elderly African-American residents of Rankin County. Among the accounts she recorded was one from a 93-year-old woman named Martha Johnson, whose grandmother had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation to the Reeds. According to Mrs. Johnson's testimony, preserved in the Tougaloo College archives, her grandmother spoke of the night when the swamp screamed, and how afterward the overseers enforced a strict curfew for months, punishing anyone found outside their quarters after dark with unusual severity. More telling was her recollection that in the days following whatever transpired in the swamp, several individuals who had worked closely with Isaiah Reed vanished from the plantation without explanation. They were never mentioned again, their names stricken from the property ledger as if they had never existed. My grandmother told me, Mrs. Johnson recalled, that one morning they woke up and certain people were just gone. Nobody asked where, nobody dared to ask, but she said the master's brother and that foreign woman had tried to help some folks get away, and it ended badly for everyone involved. The swamp kept its secrets, is how she put it. But she also said something I never forgot. She said, "Not all of them died that night. Some made it through, but we never spoke of it, not even among ourselves. Some secrets keep people alive." This tantalizing suggestion that some might have escaped the fate that befell Isaiah and Juliet aligns with a curious entry in the diary of a station master for the Illinois Central Railroad in Cairo, Illinois, dated July 1848. The entry, discovered during research for a 1963 book on the Underground Railroad, notes, "Today received a group of 7 from the deepest South, bearing papers identifying them as free persons from Mobile. Their actual origins remain unstated, but J indicates they traveled by most unusual means and at terrible cost. 2 bear fresh injuries requiring medical attention. They speak of 17 who began the journey. We shall ask no further questions and expedite their passage northward with all possible haste. Could these 7 have been part of the group that left with Isaiah and Juliet that April night? The timing would align with a difficult journey north from Mississippi, perhaps taking indirect routes to avoid detection. If so, what became of the others? The historical record offers no clear answers, only possibilities suspended in the realm between documented fact and plausible speculation. In 1874, a Union veteran named Corporal Thomas Blackwood published a memoir of his time in Mississippi during the occupation of Jackson. Among his recollections was a strange incident that occurred while his unit was quartered in what had once been the home of a prominent planter's family allied with the Reeds. Blackwood described discovering a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the library containing a small wooden box. Inside was a woman's locket, empty of any photograph or miniature, and a folded paper containing a list of names, some crossed out, others marked with small notations in a language he didn't recognize. "I showed these items to our translator," Blackwood wrote, who identified the notations as French. He said they appeared to be locations or directions, though without more context, he couldn't be certain. When I inquired with the elderly house servant about these items, her reaction was most peculiar. She became visibly distressed and denied any knowledge, though her eyes told a different story. Later that night, I found the box had disappeared from my quarters, and neither the servant nor any other household member would acknowledge it had ever existed. Perhaps the most concrete connection to the fate of Isaiah Reed emerged in 1961, when a historian researching Civil War-era correspondence discovered a letter written by a Union officer to his wife in 1864. The officer, Captain William Foster, had been tasked with investigating potential war crimes in recently occupied territories of Mississippi. In the letter, He described interviewing an elderly man who claimed to have been present at what the local white population obliquely referred to as the Reed incident. According to Foster's letter, the man, whose name was redacted even in this private correspondence, described a scene of extraordinary brutality. The old man broke down entirely when relating what he had witnessed in that swamp 16 years prior. He claims 20 armed men surrounded Reed and the woman. Along with the slaves, they were attempting to guide northward. Reed was given the opportunity to denounce his actions and return to his family, but instead made an impassioned speech about natural rights that further enraged his captors. The woman attempted to reason with them in both English and French, eventually resorting to threats that she had already sent documentation of their operation to associates in the north. Foster continued, "What followed, according to this witness, was a summary execution of both Reed and the woman, followed by the systematic elimination of witnesses. The old man claimed he alone was spared because of family connections, but was sworn to secrecy through threats against his remaining relatives. He stated that James Reed himself delivered the first blow against his brother, declaring him a traitor to family, region, and race. The witness believes some of the enslaved individuals may have escaped during the chaos, fleeing deeper into the swamp, but he could not confirm their ultimate fate." The letter concludes with Foster's own reflections. "I find this account entirely credible based on similar incidents documented during our advance. The systematic nature of the violence, the elimination of witnesses, and the community's ongoing silence all align with patterns we have observed elsewhere. I have forwarded the relevant details to headquarters, though I doubt any prosecution will result given the chaotic nature of current governance and the time elapsed since the events in question. This account, while horrifying, aligns with the fragments of evidence that have survived, the personal items discovered in the swamp during the drought of 1952, the oral histories collected from community members, and the conspicuous absences in official records where Isaiah, Reed, Juliette Montrose, and 17 others should have appeared. What makes the case of the Reed plantation particularly disturbing from a historical perspective is how thoroughly the events were obscured, not just through the destruction of records, but through the cultivation of community silence. This silence extended beyond the white power structure to include those who might have been sympathetic to the escapees, suggesting the reach and effectiveness of the terror that followed the events in the swamp. Dr. Williams, the Tougaloo College professor who collected Martha Johnson's testimony, noted in her research journal, "What strikes me about this and similar accounts is the durability of fear. More than a century after these events, elderly informants still lower their voices when discussing them, still glance over their shoulders, still request anonymity. The mechanisms of suppression have outlived those who implemented them, continuing to function through cultural memory and inherited caution." In 1967, construction workers clearing land for a new development near the former Reed plantation uncovered what appeared to be a mass grave containing the partial remains of multiple individuals. According to newspaper accounts from the time, county authorities conducted a brief investigation before declaring the site an unmarked slave cemetery unrelated to any specific incident. The remains were removed and reinterred in an unmarked section of a local cemetery with minimal documentation or analysis. Archaeologist Dr. Raymond Carter, who briefly examined the site before it was cleared, later wrote in a professional journal that the positioning of the remains and other evidence suggested a hasty, disorganized burial inconsistent with typical funerary practices of the period, whether for enslaved people or others. The site had more in common with battlefield burials or mass casualty events than with planned interments. His requests for a more thorough excavation and analysis were denied by local authorities, who cited concerns about project delays and costs. The land where the reed plantation once stood has passed through many hands since 1848, its history gradually obscured by new construction, changing boundaries, and the natural processes of environmental reclamation. But echoes of the past occasionally resurface in unexpected ways. In 1971, a surveyor mapping the area for flood control purposes reported finding an unusual clearing deep in what remained of the cypress swamp, where nothing would grow in a roughly circular area approximately 30 feet in diameter. Soil samples revealed no obvious contamination or unusual composition, leading the surveyor to note in his report, "Local workers refuse to enter this specific area, citing bad ground and old stories." From a scientific perspective, I can identify no reason for the persistent absence of vegetation. The final documented connection to Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose came in 1968, when a historical researcher named Margaret Collins was contacted by an elderly woman living in Chicago who claimed to possess a family Bible containing information relevant to Collins's work on resistance movements in the antebellum South. The woman, who identified herself as Esther Williams, invited Collins to her home to view the Bible and discuss its provenance. According to Collins' research notes archived at the University of Chicago, the Bible contained a handwritten family record beginning in the 1850s with an individual named Samuel Johnson, born in Mississippi but documented as residing in Canada by 1852. On a separate page, carefully inserted between the leaves of the Bible, was a folded letter written in faded ink. The letter, dated simply April 1848, read in part, "Should you receive this message, know that our mutual friend Jay has made the ultimate sacrifice so that you might have this chance. The planned route through the cypress became compromised, necessitating a diversion that proved fatal for some among us. 7 now continue northward via the alternate path discussed. The remainder, including Jay and the lady from New Orleans, encountered the search party near the landmark we identified as the 3 Sisters, presumably distinctive cypress trees. What transpired there I cannot fully describe, as I was ordered to flee with the children while the others created a diversion. The sounds that followed will haunt me until my dying day. Should we not arrive within the month, consider the lower route compromised and adjust accordingly." The letter was signed only with the initial D. Collins noted that Esther Williams claimed to be the great-granddaughter of a woman who had escaped from Mississippi as a child in 1848, though she knew few details of the journey beyond what had been passed down as family lore, that angels had fallen so that others might fly free. When Collins attempted to schedule a follow-up interview to authenticate the letter and gather more information, she discovered that the address provided belonged to an apartment that had been vacant for months, with no forwarding information for any previous tenant named Williams. "If Providence allows our safe passage, we will look for the sign at the next station as planned." The phone number she had been given was no longer in service. Whether Esther Williams was using a pseudonym, had relocated suddenly, or had perhaps never existed beyond being a vehicle for sharing this fragment of historical evidence, remains unknown. This pattern of tantalizing evidence appearing briefly before vanishing again has characterized much of the research into the events at the Reed plantation. It suggests either extraordinary coincidence or, perhaps more plausibly, the continuing impact of fears that have persisted across generations, fears that speaking too openly about these events might still carry consequences, even more than a century later. For modern historians attempting to reconstruct what happened on that April night in 1848, the challenge lies not just in the fragmentation of evidence, but in interpreting the silences between the fragments. As historian David Blight has noted in other contexts, the most profound historiographical challenges often involve not just analyzing what was documented, but understanding why certain events went undocumented or why their documentation was systematically destroyed. The story of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose exists now in that liminal space between confirmed history and informed speculation. We know they existed. We know they formed a connection that defied the social norms of their time and place. We know they disappeared in April 1848, along with 17 enslaved individuals from the Reed plantation. We know that afterward, extraordinary efforts were made to erase not just their actions, but their very existence from the historical record. Beyond these established facts lies a realm of possibilities supported by fragments of evidence and oral testimony. That they were attempting to guide these 17 individuals to freedom via an underground railroad route previously unknown to history. That they were betrayed or discovered, that they died in the cypress swamp at the hands of James Reed and his allies, that some of those they were attempting to help may have escaped despite the failure of the larger plan. What remains most significant about this nearly forgotten episode is what it represents, a challenge to simplified narratives about the past, particularly regarding resistance to slavery in the Deep South. The story of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose suggests that even in places where the institution of slavery was most entrenched, there were individuals who recognized its moral bankruptcy and were willing to act on that recognition, even at tremendous personal risk. It also illustrates the extraordinary measures that power structures would take to suppress not just resistance itself, but even the knowledge that resistance had occurred. The thoroughness with which this story was nearly erased from history speaks to how threatening such knowledge was considered to be, how important it was to maintain the fiction that the system was universally accepted and unchallenged, even by those who benefited from it. As the sun sets over what was once the Reed plantation, no visible markers commemorate the events that transpired there. The cypress swamp has retreated before development. The separate house where Isaiah lived has long since been reduced to foundation stones, gradually sinking into the Mississippi soil. The main plantation house was destroyed during the Civil War, its footprint now occupied by more recent construction, whose residents likely have no knowledge of what occurred there generations before their arrival. Yet the story persists, carried forward through fragments of documents, collected oral histories, archaeological evidence, and the work of historians determined to recover narratives that power sought to suppress. In that persistence lies a different kind of monument, not one of stone or metal, but of remembered truth gradually reassembled from the fragments that survived the attempt to destroy it entirely. For those 17 individuals whose names were recorded in Isaiah's journal but later lost when those pages disappeared from Union custody, this remembered narrative may be the only commemoration they will ever receive. Their individual stories, their specific fates, their hopes and fears as they set out into the night with two unlikely allies. All this remains largely unknown and perhaps unknowable. But the broad outlines of their collective story, and that of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose, have emerged from historical shadows through persistent investigation and the gradual collection of evidence across more than a century. That emergence represents a small but significant victory over those who believed their power included the ability to determine not just what happened, but what would be remembered as having happened. As historian Martha Simmons wrote in the conclusion of her thesis on undocumented resistance, the final legacy of Isaiah Reed and Juliet Montrose may be found not in what they accomplished. Their immediate goals appear to have ended in tragedy, but in the fact that we can speak of them at all. Despite extraordinary efforts to erase them from history, fragments of their story survived, gradually coalescing into a narrative that, while incomplete, testifies to their existence and their choice. In that survival lies a reminder that power, no matter how thoroughly it controls the present, cannot entirely determine how the future will remember the past. For those who study America's difficult histories, the story of the Reed plantation stands as both challenge and inspiration, a challenge to recover what has been deliberately obscured, and an inspiration in the form of those who recognized injustice and chose action over complicity, regardless of the cost. Their story reminds us that moral clarity has always existed, even in times and places where its expression was most dangerous, and that the historical record, despite its gaps and distortions, still contains traces of those who defied the prevailing moral compromises of their era. In the words attributed to Isaiah Reed in his final journal entry, "History may forget us, but the moral arc remains, and perhaps someday what we attempt tonight will be understood as part of a larger struggle that, despite all opposition, bends eventually toward justice." More than a century and a half later, as we piece together the fragments of their story, that understanding gradually emerges, not as complete knowledge of what transpired on that April night, but as recognition of its significance within the longer moral struggle it embodied. In that recognition, perhaps, lies a measure of the justice that eluded them in life. The cypress swamp keeps its secrets. The Mississippi soil gradually reclaims the physical evidence of what occurred there. But in archives and oral histories, in archaeological fragments and scholarly reconstruction, Isaiah Reed, Juliet Montrose, and those 17 unnamed individuals continue to exist, not just as victims of historical violence, but as agents who chose resistance when compliance would have been easier and safer. Their choice, and the efforts made to obscure it, remind us that history is not merely what happened, but what power allowed to be recorded as having happened, and that recovering the fullness of the past often requires listening for the stories that were never supposed to be told. As night falls over what was once the Reed plantation, the darkness holds no supernatural terror, no restless spirits or mysterious lights. The true horror lies not in ghostly manifestations, but in the recognition of what humans have done to other humans, and in the systematic efforts to ensure those actions would go unrecorded and unremembered. For those willing to look beyond the sanitized narratives and convenient silences, to piece together the fragments of suppressed truth, that recognition comes with a responsibility to acknowledge what happened, to understand its continuing implications, and to ensure that the stories power sought to silence are finally heard. In that acknowledgement, perhaps, we find the most fitting memorial for Isaiah Reed, Juliet Montrose, and those who disappeared with them into the cypress swamp on an April night in 1848. Not a physical monument, but the ongoing commitment to recover and preserve the truth, especially those truths that others have gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The separate house stands no more, the swamp has retreated, the plantation is long gone. But their story remains, emerging gradually from darkness into historical light, a reminder that beneath the surface of official narratives lie countless suppressed truths waiting to be recovered, and that no effort to erase the past, however thorough, can entirely succeed when future generations commit themselves to uncovering what was meant to stay buried forever.